So I'm going to talk about a few concepts in the description. I'll put timestamps to the various ones, and the first one will be about how different cards are better at attacking or blocking. You can have a concept of this card's good, this card's bad, but different cards, sometimes they want to do different things, and they'll perform better if they're in the right environment. And here's an example of a few, these creatures like Wood Elves, Forecasting Fortune Teller, they're kind of cards, small creatures which enter the battlefields. These cards tend to be better at blocking, and then you can see sort of cards with keywords like Menace or Haste. Obviously, these cards are better at attacking. So when you're evaluating cards, it helps to think about, is my deck trying to attack or block, so you can get more value out of these cards. Death Touchers, especially 1 mana, 1/1 Death Touchers, those tend to, for example, be better when you're trying to block as opposed to attack. So thinking about what are the kind of decks that want to play vanilla blockers, it's usually better, obviously, in decks that try and win with eventual board stall cards, card draw. In Hobbit, it would be like the 2 mana, the draw spell that has flashback to draw, random mana sinks. Basically, it's just make a board stall and then you win with sort of a mana sink card. And also another thing that's good about these blockers is it actually they help you conserve your removal, because that way if your opponent plays an attacker, you don't have to use a removal if you play a good blocker, and you can save the removal for their bombs. That's pretty, it might not be super intuitive or obvious at first, but I mean, I guess it sounds obvious, so I'll keep moving on. But yeah, that's why control decks do tend to want these value ETB blockers, so that you can deal with your opponent's vanilla attackers. Then, talking about creatures that want to attack, the opposite of the blockers, um, usually they're kind of cards that almost force your opponent to block, and then that lets you leverage cards that punish them for blocking. So I gave some examples here. There's like Atuma. This draws a card when it attacks. Moon Glove Extractor, it draws a card when it attacks. So obviously, if you attack with one of these cards, your opponent's really incentivized to block, and then you're able to combine it with combat tricks that have a lingering presence to 2-for-1 them. It's just a pretty good combination. I also wanted to differentiate that there's different types of tricks and payoffs. Um, I covered this in another video, but I'll just go over it a little bit here. Obviously, you want to pay attention to cards like tricks that generate a lasting advantage versus not. It's like a small detail, but sometimes you have cards like Giant Growth, and sometimes you have like that. It doesn't really. It's good on tempo, but it doesn't really. You know, if they block and you Giant Growth, you're not getting a real advantage outside of the mana. Whereas for some of these other combat tricks, they might cantrip or they leave an effect on the battlefield like an equipment. Um, and I'll talk more about like how there are ways to get more value out of normal combat tricks by Giant Growth. But anyway, this is kind of the concept. Um, Sometimes they're just aggressively statted. Sometimes, I guess this is kind of outside the scope, but it's just talking about how like combat tricks can have value with creatures like Lifelink, and also being aware that some creatures want different kinds of combat tricks, but that's not as relevant to Hobbit. But it's just to say like not all combat tricks are equal. Like you want to pay attention to the kind that your creature wants. Um, but yeah. So anyway, for example, with Golem, I'll use some Hobbit examples, like some of these Menace cards. They make it so that your opponent really wants to block them, and then if you can combine them with various tricks, that's a good idea. And the whole point of this, because that all sounds obvious, is that you can't just say, oh, this is a good card, this is or this is a good card. You kind of want to think about obviously the deck you're playing and how it fits into it. So that's kind of framing, like, am I attacking, am I blocking? Obviously there's decks kind of in between. The next concept I'm going to talk about is, do you care about hitting land drops? Um, so some decks might have really expensive cards. Like if you have this 7 mana bomb, it's a really good bomb, but it's not that easy to get to 7 mana in a normal deck. Or maybe you have 6 drops in your deck. Something I've noticed is that if you care about hitting land drops, then random cards that say draw a card get better. So like all like Plunder, Divination, Quick Study. Because if you play like, let's say, a random 2-color aggressive deck, like a black-red aggressive deck, and you just play cards that say draw 2 cards in them, you're going to draw extra lands, and if you don't have as good use for lands, then you're not going to you may get as much value out of your draw spell. But obviously, if you start having 7 drops in your deck and you care about hitting lands, then it's almost like a combo to have your draw spell and your 7 drop together. And there's also cards that can make having extra lands beneficial, like looting effects, like Owen, because it can be pretty common that you might play spells, and I'll get into it more when I get in the mana section, that basically make it so you just end up with extra mana. Cards like Wood Elves, that they're a spell, but they basically just put a forest in play, and then having ways to use the extra lands gets beneficial. But it's basically saying like, yeah, if you keep this in mind, that if you're trying to get, I guess it sounds pretty obvious, But keep in mind that like if you have more expensive cards, draw spells get better. Which maybe won't sound intuitive because people might think, oh, that's clunky and that's clunky, but yeah, they combine together well. And I also want to touch on mana bases in sealed and various ways they get weird. So sealed is one of the most bizarre formats for mana because you're very incentivized. You're more incentivized to splash in sealed than most formats for probably kind of obvious reasons. You might have bombs in a color you're not playing, or maybe you just don't have enough playables in two color. So you get more incentivized to try and splash. But there's a lot of things to keep in mind when splashing. So I wanted to talk about a few of the things. And one I'll give by going through an example of three cards from Hobbit that are all fix your mana in a little bit different ways and ways to leverage them the best. And obviously, this won't factor for other formats as much, but whatever. So, these are three of the common colorless ways that can help fix your mana. So, you have Giant's Boulder, which is 1 mana, fixes your mana, 7 mana, destroy it. And this card, some people might think it's bad, but if you're playing a 4 color deck, or it goes back to hitting your land drops, if you care about hitting your land drops, it can get a bit better because if you're good at hitting your land drops, you're more reliably able to sacrifice it. And if you're also playing a more controlling deck, you might care more about the destroy mode because you can't win by just attacking your opponent. So if they play an unbeatable bomb, it's more important to have a giant boulder to answer it in the situations you draw a lot of cards. So this card can get a bit better once you're playing 4 colors, 3, 4 colors, or if you have a lot of ways to draw cards. I guess it almost goes two ways with the draw cards, because also if you draw more cards, like one of the disadvantages of boulders is it doesn't do anything until turn 7, but if you have cards like Plunder the Troll Shaws, then you have more cards to cast in between you get to turn 7, so you're not as punished for being down a card. Then Ult's Rush, it's interesting, it's almost like a Mox Diamond or a Chrome Mox, because it instantly fixes your mana when you cast it, but you don't draw a card next turn, so you're actually further away from hitting your land drops, and you're further away from your other colors and your bombs. But there are certain ways that it can get better. For example, there's a card in this set that cares about when you attack. So whenever you attack, you get to amass, and Ultra Rush is, pretty good with that, the Misty Mountain Raiders. Or if you have cards like Golem that can put counters on it to make the 1/2 body relevant, the more equipments you have, stuff like that, then the more likely you are for this to be a real card and it gets better. So basically, like, this is kind of a cheap creature, but when you have cards that are good with cheap evasive creatures, equipments, caring about attacking, this can get a little bit better because then it's more likely that the 1/2 matters and that is helpful. Or even sometimes if you have cards like Wood Elves, like a lot of Wood Elves, then you can use it for double blocking, which I guess might sound weird, but whatever. And then Long Body Grey Dog is another form of sort of mana fixing, but it only finds you a one-time shot of mana, so that also will factor differently into your mana. So it's just keeping in mind that all these different forms of fixing hit into your mana in different ways. Like Ult's Rush kind of puts you down a card. Giant's Boulder, it puts you down like a spell until turn 7, but it doesn't put you down. You don't have to like skip a draw step. Like they're low impact in different ways. This is low impact because it's a 1/2. This is a low impact because it does nothing until turn 7. And this is like a 3-drop. So if your 3-drop slot is clogged, it might not be as good, and it gets you a one-time use, so it can be better with ramping or whatever. Like Ult's Rush is much worse with like a 7-drop because it makes you lose a draw step, and you need your draw steps to play 7 drops, whereas the dog obviously gets a treasure. And then there's other things, because you're gonna play more spells that help you fix your mana. You want to be aware of flooding when you add a lot of fixing, because for example, you can imagine if you have an opening hand and your opening hand is 3 lands, 2 dogs, and 2 like magnificent ends or 2 pinecone strikes, then you won't have as much use for the mana. So you might want to tinker with your mana base in weird ways. And one of the things I'll talk about is playing more cantrips. So also one of the things with splashing is that splashing tends to be better when you have more draw effects in your deck. Cards like Ragged Short Spear, Plunder the Trollshaw, because they help you obviously dig to your lands, so they almost act as more sources in a way. Like if you play Plunder, it helps you find your lands. They also help you find the cards you're splashing, obviously, because the more cantrips you have, the more likely you are to draw your bomb. And they also give you something to do. Like one of the downsides of splashing is if you're playing a low curve aggro deck in 2 colors and you draw your splash card without the way to cast it, then you might not have anything to cast. Whereas if you're playing a more controlling deck with all this card draw, even if you don't have your mana, you might be able to just spend mana on the card draw. So yeah, be aware of like spells. The main point here is be aware of spells like Wood Elves that basically all they do is really make more mana so that you don't just flood, because you're going to be playing more, you might be playing more mana than usual, which means you might want more various ways like Ragged Short Spear to discard extra lands or things like that. Yeah. Then the next concept I want to talk about is just being able to identify what are the weaknesses my deck has, and then you can build around like shoring up those weaknesses or whatever. Um, so yeah, I'll give a quick example. I'll give a few examples. And using how like I want to talk about how you can use quote unquote weak cards to shore up weaknesses, but that doesn't mean just trying to put weak cards in your deck. That's what I have here. Like cohesion doesn't mean just play weak cards in your deck. It means actually thinking what are the weaknesses I might have and how can I adapt to it. So I'll give an example. Smog's Fury. It's a 2 mana combat trick that gives +3/+0 first strike and first strike. A lot of people might think it's a pretty bad card, but like let's say for example you have a deck that has a lot of menace creatures. Like there's a lot of menace creatures in the set, and you don't have a lot of ways to take advantage of the fact they have menace well, just because the way your deck is, you're not that good at using it. Then maybe you want a Smog's Fury, because Smog's Fury can really reward you for having menace creatures, because if you attack and they double block, then you get to eat both. So it's what I was talking about with Giant Growth earlier, whereas if you Giant Growth, it's only a 1-for-1. But if you have a menace creature and then you Giant Growth it, maybe you get a 2-for-1, and in this case, it gives first strike. Or the Howl, that's with a land drop. Let's say you have a black-red deck, but you have a 7-drop, like let's say you have 2 of the 7-drop Hill Giant Bomb. Well, one of your weaknesses is you're not that good at hitting your land drops, so you might want to consider playing the Howl, because the draw 2 card will really help you get to your 7-drops. That's how you're using some of these cards, and Howl's not really a weak card, but it's not a card you might not always play, and that's thinking about like, oh, this card's not as good, but I'm getting more value because it's helping doing something in my deck. And here's an example of a build I had where I was playing a lot of cards that weren't that good to shore up weaknesses I had. So, for example, Gandalf, this 5-mana wizard, and Ravenhill Flock, they're not considered very good cards, but if you look at my deck, I don't have very many 4-drops or 5-drops, especially because this Partings is almost more of a 3-drop. And my deck had a lot of ways to stall the board. I had a lot of Death Touch creatures. I had a lot of, I had some removal. I had some big creatures, but I wanted a way to break, like when I create a board stall, I wanted a way to break it. And a big flyer, or this Gandalf that can draw 3 cards, or also this Decree. It's not considered a great card. You might not always play it, but again, I was kind of good at stalling the board, and I had a decent, like some ramp spells, like the dog, a lot of ways to hit my land drops, the Troop of Ponies. So I'm like, okay, I want to play, cheap ways to get on the board, like the Outer Cop, the Reveler, whatever, and then some bombs that can take over from a board stall. And I'll give an example to show how the first build I made of this deck was I actually built a black-green deck, and this is an example of what I mean by good cards. Like in theory, this is playing a lot of, good cards. I have 2 of the Murders, I have the Blade, I have, this Rampager, it's not bad. I have this Prowler that's really good, but I felt like this deck was kind of fighting itself because I felt like I had a lot of cards that wanted to block and attack in the same deck, and I felt like this deck could flood easily because I felt like I didn't have a lot of 4 or 5-drops and I didn't have card draw. So my cards were cheap, but I didn't feel like I'd be able to leverage it well because I thought I would just run out of things to do. Because you can imagine the way this plays out. Like I play some Outer Cops, they kind of like are going to stall the board. Maybe I quarrel a creature, but this creature is better at blocking than attacking. I don't have ways to fuel up. Like I have very little card advantage in this deck, and uh, yeah, I don't have card draw. So I felt like I would just flood out. And even though I was playing a lot of good cards, I felt my cards would kind of be fighting each other because some of my cards, like my bad and my like the black cards, like I just felt like this deck didn't have finishing power basically. And yeah, and even though this deck is technically might be playing like cards that look bad, it fit very cohesively to make a better curve, shore up the weaknesses of the cards the green cards had, and I felt since my mana was good, I could just splash the Chief Warg's Company anyway, which was obviously the best black card I had. So I'll give some more examples of what I mean. And okay, yeah. So this is an example of what I mean. So I'm talking about like you want to shore up weaknesses, but you don't want to just play bad cards to do it. So this is an example of a build I saw where I saw somebody played this Thorn's Last Stand. It's basically a go wide card. It gives +2/+1 to all your creatures. And this is a card that's not that good. You don't want to play most of the time. But somebody might be like, oh, I'm in blue-white, maybe I should play it. But I don't think, if you look at the deck, I don't think it's really shoring up weaknesses. In fact, I think this deck has kind of good individual card quality, so I'd rather just play some of these creatures that are solid, like Master Counselors, Ravenhill Flock, the Steer, because if you look at this deck, it has decent card draw, it has some removal, it has some bombs, and I don't think the go wide card's really fixing any problems. So even though maybe you find some go wide cards, it's like a lot of your cards are just not playing into it. In fact, the last stand's kind of bad with the Troll Shaws because you're kind of spending mana drawing cards rather than getting a board presence, unless you care about the disenchant mode. And this was another thing. This was the same pool, and some people might be like, oh, I don't want to play blue white because they might hear that, oh, blue white's not that good in the format, so I might want to play red white. But this is where it pays off to be like, okay, what's really dragging me into red? Because Misty Mountain Riders is a pretty good card. Maybe there's Lonely Mountain, maybe there's a Strike, but there's just not very many good red cards. So even though you got to say, oh, I played white red, and obviously, I mean, Snow Slope Hunters is pretty good. There's some fine red cards in the sideboard too. Um, and I was just realized, okay, the Lake Town Toymaker's here. But anyway, the point is this here. If you really think about the week, like another question to ask is like, what's actually drawing me into the color? And you can see that it's not actually that much drawing you into the color, and there actually is a lot drawing you into blue white, even though it's not that strong. So that's how you can play a color combination that might not be that strong, but you just be like, yeah, I have a Bard's Company, I have the Patrol Shaws, I have the Apothecary, like I just have good blue white stuff. Um, and I don't know, maybe there was even some other sort of Bant or whatever deck, I don't know, but this blue white deck does not seem that bad to me. Oh, there's Killy too. That's a really good, white rare. So then I'm going to talk about the various ways you can lean into strengths and and weaknesses of your pool. So here was a pool I had, um, one of the strengths I had was the mana, because I had two Hobbit holes, I had three dual lands, but I also had an Old Thrush, a Troop of Ponies, a map, and a boulder. So I realized this was actually a deck where my 3-color mana base was actually just good, and I had a lot of my spells help me hit my lands. So I had a bunch of Bilbos, and Bilbo can help you find lands because it scries and it draws a card. Dory makes treasures, and yeah, and this was also a really cool deck because I used Part of Friendship. This is a controversial card. Some people don't think it's that good, but I had, I think, 5 ways to ramp it out in this deck because I had 2 Dories, I had a Wood Elves, I had a Troop of Ponies, and I had this Bjorn, which can let you play extra lands, and I had a lot of card draw, which was nice with the Bjorn, and then I even had Bilbo. So, like, one of the problems with Part of Friendship is sometimes they might just not attack, but I could just play a Bilbo, sack it to Legend Rule, and then get the trigger. And you can see like both side Wanderers, and people might not think this card's not that good, but as you saw, I had so many ways to ramp, and I had solid tempo because you see, even though it's kind of a control deck, I have a lot of cheap plays, a lot of cheap plays, but I still have some good top end, so that when the game goes long, I have ways to take advantage of the fact I'm starting the board. I thought this was a really strong deck. Yeah, and then this is another strengths I had, where the strengths is just that I had deep 2 colors. You can see I had really good mana. I had triple Hobbit Hole and even more dual lands, and I was really trying to make a soup deck work. But when I looked at my pool, I actually just had I felt like a reasonable black-red deck. Like, I don't think this deck's very good. I think this pool, I mean, part of the problem is so many of my cards were in the lands. But anyway, I thought this was like a reasonable black red deck, and like maybe I can get 3 or 4 wins, and then I can get my gems back. Because you don't always need, like, some people will say, oh, you need to get 7 wins to get the box, and I guess that's maybe for an event like Hobbit where the EV is so skewed, like maybe that's kind of true. But the way I usually think about directs is I see a lot of the EV and getting 3-4 wins too. So I'm like, if I can build a deck that can get 4 wins, I get my entry back, and that's actually a pretty good result because that really helps at the end of the weekend. But whatever, that's besides the point of the video. The point is the strengths of this deck was that I had deep 2 colors, so I could lean into that and just play a 2-color deck. Even though I had good mana, I didn't really want to splash because I didn't have that much card draw, and I didn't have like Giga Bombs to splash. Like, what would I splash? Some Bilbos, but it's not like I use the extra draw that well. Anyway, I'm not saying this was the perfect build, but whatever. Then here's another example of a deck weaknesses and how I tried to shore it up. So this deck's weakness was that it kind of needs finishers to convert card draw. Like, it has a lot of efficient interaction. It has triple Magnificent End, double Stone by Stonelight, um, 2 River's Grasp. It has Troop of Ponies to ramp, but it doesn't really have great finisher. Bard's Company is a good card. It's not the best finisher. So I actually played blue-white with triple both side Wanderers because Mirkwood's really good. Wood Elves is good. My mana was solid because I had 3 dual lands and I played the Boulder. I have Plunder to hit land drops. And I thought this deck played out fine. I don't know if this was the optimal build. This is the kind of deck I want to play because it's really cute. But this is, again, where it's like, this is not a normal card you play in a blue-white control deck, but you're like, what are my weakness? I need finishers. This is kind of a solid finisher, and it plays well with the fact that I'm spamming removal, but also I have Troop of Ponies, I've Plundered, I have Old Fat Spider, I have Bilbo, I have Wood Elves to help me hit my land drops. So you can definitely imagine this deck can be solid. And again, the Magnificent is more of a 2-drop, so the curve is better than you think. This is, again, a deck that can have a lot of cheap plays, but also play a long game. Okay, I don't know what this slide is. What happened? Is that the last slide? Okay, so yeah. I have 2 other things up. What's this black red deck? I don't know. I guess that's most of it. So yeah, most of the concepts is that like a lot of building sealed is being like, what are the weaknesses of my deck? How do I shore them up? And like playing towards cards you have. And like, yeah, are you attacking? Or are you blocking? Because a lot of cards are good or bad, but a golem is not going to be as good in a controlling deck necessarily, or a prowler. So I guess it sounds kind of obvious. Yeah, I guess that's most of what I have to say about the video. Yeah, the mana basis. So I guess I'll just stop it here, I guess.